Welcome everybody to this Ask the Analyst session for the 2025 Fosway 9 Grid for Cloud HR. I'm John Kennard, Content Editor at Fosway Group, Europe's #1 HR industry analyst, and I will be your host for today's session. Founded in 1996, Fosway Group provides in-depth corporate research on next-gen HR talent and learning practices, providing analyst and advisory services to more than 3,000 European and international headquartered multinationals and corporates. As you can see on the slide there, a bit of information about the Fosway corporate membership before we get started. The FCM is a private network for corporate HR learning and talent leaders, offering deeper access to data and insights behind the 9 grids and realities research, which is our core research, as well as monthly virtual roundtables on key topics, private analyst time, and accelerated buying support. There's plenty more besides this. Do contact us afterwards if you're interested in learning more. Before I introduce the two speakers, a little bit about the report we're about to hear about. It highlights a persistent disconnect between tasks, skills, and jobs across many of the suites. With automation set to touch every part of the business, action beats planning. Enterprises that fail to map tasks between jobs and skills will struggle to redeploy people at speed and at scale. There's so much more to talk about. So I'm delighted to welcome lead analyst on this research, Sven Elbert, as well as Fosway CEO and founder, David Wilson, to discuss and dissect all the findings in this latest iteration of the 9 Grid for Cloud HR. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. We will have a Q&A at the end. Feel free to ask questions throughout. Please use the chat pane for discussion rumination. Do play nicely. And I will save up all the questions and ask them at the end for our main Q&A section. Before we go into the 9 Grid itself, a bit of scene setting from David, please. Let's take it away.
Hi, and thanks, John, and hello to everybody from me too. Before we obviously talk about the 9 grids, and if you've attended these before, you'll know this. So I apologize for going through it again, but we always think it's worthwhile just to provide a few minutes of context around actually where the 9 grid comes from, and in particular, obviously, the sort of research processes and elements involved that we put together when we actually come to the 9 grid. The bulk of the research obviously it happens across the whole of the year, but we also have a separate vendor process that runs over the summer in the case of the Cloud HR 9 grid, and the elements that are involved in that are quite varied. So obviously we get input all year round from our corporate research network members. We run lots of roundtables around that. That obviously provides us with some overall high level. We also run obviously corporate inquiry and private advisory work again throughout the year. On top of that, we then run basically a sort of more timed process around it leading up to the 9 grid itself, including obviously a whole vendor data capture process, lots and lots of briefings, customer reference calls, and so on. So there's an awful lot of elements that get pulled together before we actually get even into the analysis phase to discuss, potentially how we're going to review both the trends in the market, but also in terms of the positioning of the vendors. The vendors included are based on effectively those that are in active use or active consideration within our corporate network primarily, but also some of the innovator companies that we're tracking also in the background that we think have a potential to be achieved in that. It's not a pay-for-play environment. Vendors can't buy their way onto a 9 grid, and they also can't buy their way off of it. So the decision around who's included is purely based on analysts' view of relevance for inclusion. Obviously that creates an objectivity in terms of the assessment we're doing. The primary point of view I just want to emphasize is not what the vendors say. It is actually the view that we get from customers. So that's why that customer side of the research process is so important. That is always the kind of dominant consideration, particularly obviously when we're looking around, the potential and the performance of vendors within the corporate environment. Vendor input is also really important to us because obviously we use it for cross-validation of assumptions. Maybe we can spot things that we've missed in terms of from the wider market process. And also understanding, obviously looking at the vendor specific performance and so on, growth, etc., is also a useful input into it. So, I mean, in summary, the actual 9-grid report, even let alone the image itself, is the tip of a very, very large iceberg of research and data, trying to really understand objectively what's going on in the market and how different vendors are able to serve the needs of enterprise customers, and how they perform. As a consequence of that, I mean, again, I know we're going to talk about the 9-grid image in a minute. The important thing, I think, is to also understand, as I said, sometimes the backdrop we're comparing that against. So I would certainly suggest to everybody that they download and read the full report. That gives you certainly a lot of really interesting insight around the market and solution trends that we're looking at that maybe shape this year how we're weighting the assessment. It also gives you more information around the actual 9-grid structure itself, what the variables involved in things like potential performance, presence are, etc. That gives you some actually insight around the model itself. So on that note, I think I'll hand over to Sven specifically to talk about the actual Cloud HR model and 9-grid.
Yeah, thank you, David, and hello from my side as well. Yeah, I think the functional model is really important for our assessment as well. We have basically introduced quite a few AI criteria into the model over the last few years, all across the board in all those functional areas, the inner circle being people operations and people management, and the outer circle in somewhat lighter blue from recruiting, onboarding into reward and recognition is all the talent people success functional areas. And obviously a lot of AI innovation and innovation overall has been happening there as well. And this is then supplemented by 4 layers that provide enterprise context, which are also part of the assessment. How well does the system, the solutions play and interconnect with the ecosystem in terms of employee experience, analytics, integration capabilities, and the wider intelligence functional scope as well, if that makes sense. So we have a couple of 100 line items in this functional model. It's growing year over year, and we have even added a separate process for the AI model, which looks a little bit deeper into that, which we'll touch on later a little bit as well. For now, maybe if we move on to the next slide, I can explain a little bit the 9-grid, and David has obviously mentioned some of the trends that the report is mentioning. I haven't put all of them on the slide, just a few. The market obviously continued to grow at a steadier rate. The suite providers have been selling deeper into their installed base. There was also a significant battle around budgets for AI, enterprise AI, where HCM suite providers are competing against ERPs, work tech platforms that we saw. Customers are still resisting AI usage bills. And I think overall, what's also worth noting is that the market buyers, suite providers have been much, much more acquisitive than maybe in previous years. And this goes from the big ones that you have read in the headlines, but also, vendors buying real-time payroll engines, workforce management solutions for better frontline coverage, and as well expanding into more adjacent areas to HR, financial planning, analysis, for example. One of the major vendors has even been taken private to accelerate AI innovation. So obviously a lot of things happening in that field, if that makes sense. With all our analysis around the AI in HR itself, let's not forget that one of the key tasks and key strategic roles for HR is emerging in work redesign. As AI reshapes jobs, HR's role is changing there as well. And people leaders have to look at how work gets redesigned itself. So it has much wider implications than AI in HR. It's almost like, how does AI affect the wider business the roles in the main core business processes. So it's not just about like auto-drafting job descriptions or inferring skills. It's much more also about understanding in terms of strategic workforce planning, what are the skills of the future? What analytics do you need to assess what skills you need to build up? Maybe there's also some things where you want to redeploy staff through maybe an internal mobility marketplace. So this is all in play at the same time. And one important mention that I should highlight is that the report also speaks about a bit of a link between work and skills itself. So task is becoming increasingly important. Yet most of the HCM vendors have not maybe necessarily looked at that business object very much. Most are still focusing on skills, and then all the other things on, you know, maybe matching that into learning content or to shift patterns or what have you. So AI is also providing vendors with some edge advantage, particularly the ones that have invested a little bit more can benefit from this. Again, this is also something which we will be publishing another report later this week, as we will discuss later again, but definitely something where a lot of the vendors have started to invest, but not many have gotten very, very far. So those that have invested a lot are actually able to, you know, be a bit ahead of the curve. And for buyers, this obviously means to decide whether they want to invest in 2025. It has not necessarily been the major driver of any like major core HR system replacements, but as time progresses, this I expect this will increasingly become an element. AI agents is obviously one of the next tests for HR, more autonomous work. We're still seeing them in the early stages of adoption, some pilot cases. So that's an interesting area of where AI is getting applied. And payroll is becoming lower touch. So here AI is used really more for validation of inputs, finding potential errors or problems very early in the process, not very late when you actually want to, like the day before the pay run or whatever. So I think those are really important improvements that can help and streamline the operational efficiency of some of the HR operational teams beneath it. So far, maybe for the trends in terms of the vendor placements and where everybody has landed. Where do I start? Maybe in the top. Should I start in the top right corner? Maybe that's not a good idea, but maybe I should start there. The 9-grid obviously is an instrument where there is value in every zone. So just don't look at the top right corner, the strategic leader zone all the time. There's value in every zone. It depends on what type of organization, what type of requirements you have, but I will start there nonetheless. And this year we have assessed Workday as a strategic leader with excelling trajectory, both in terms of their potential trajectory and in terms of the performance trajectory. There's an acceleration and increase within their momentum. SAP similarly has moved upwards in terms of the potential trajectory from last year. So that's an expanding trajectory in terms of a functional scope and the sophistication of solution, mainly driven by AI. Oracle placed more at the center, also still at very high growth rates and high rates of AI and wider innovation, but relatively compared to last year and to themselves, it is more stable than the two others, where it's more in terms of an accelerating movement compared to themselves or the market as a whole. For the first time, we have included UKG as a strategic leader. This is the workforce management specialism that we have assessed this year. So that is a move from a previous year. We assessed them for people operations specialism, and this is now a move into strategic leader. A few of the other maybe noteworthy mentions, if we move into Core Leader, there's been one new provider in Core Leader, which is Personio, who have headquartered in Germany, who have invested significantly in maturing the scope and the sophistication of their solution. So that's why we've put them at the mid-band of potential. But a lot of other providers there as well, with strong momentum from a trajectory perspective. Access Group, Telencia, Hybob, all with an upward trajectory in terms of the potential. UKG Ready, so this is the HCM solution with a right side trajectory, so accelerating in terms of performance. Deal is a new inclusion for a specialism in long tail HCM, and yeah, very interesting provider who's also investing more now into wider HCM functionality. And the list goes on, so there's obviously quite a lot of them. David, is there anything else we want to highlight, or someone that we should discuss? Or maybe in the chat there's some questions around some specifics here that we can answer.
A couple of comments that I'd make just in addition to that. So I think we moved Microsoft back because although there are lots of elements it's playing around, and we're particularly looking at what it's been doing with Viva around the employee experience and the capability sets there. But in reality, I think we haven't seen a lot of that materialize in a form that's starting to dominate the corporate decisions and thinking. And similarly, one of the other big changes was moving ServiceNow back into strategic challenger. So ServiceNow we've been tracking because of what they were doing in terms of not just like HR help desk and stuff, but particularly because of employee workflows and the way that was a few years ago starting to impact, again, some of the larger enterprises in the way they were thinking about the way employees were engaging with HR processes across the organization. And I think we've seen, to some degree, whilst they continue to make progress on that, it feels like that the momentum around that has rather kind of dropped off a little bit in terms of the corporate decision making, and that other companies have kind of returned back a little bit more to looking at the employee journey being more within the HCR platform, and potentially there's less disruption in terms of than there has been maybe previously. So those are kind of think a logical one. I think the other one also is we looking at Cornerstone with the as a more of a different lens as around their as a specialist around a kind of adaptive HCM story, which is still very relevant in EMEA. So this sort of hybrid HCM talent skills story, and around what they now talk about as workforce agility and their Galaxy architecture as well. So that's also another kind of significant change at the kind of strategic level. I think obviously in the mid-level, there continues to be very, very competitive in the sort of mid-enterprise space and below. And as Sven said earlier, I think for organizations looking at mid-sized organizations or organizations in retail or other areas where, for example, they're very margin sensitive, there is a huge amount of reason to not be looking at the large enterprise solutions, which, as you can see, generally are colored blue, which means that they have a much higher TCO sometimes than a lot of the mid-tier does. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of movement and agility in all parts of the market, and it continues to redefine itself a little bit in terms of, obviously AI is a huge driver across everything, and also just the way it deals with the kind of full suite, talent and skills topics and all those kinds of things. So there's movement everywhere, I think. And Sven has also mentioned around payroll as well. So obviously that the way pay relates to people relate to work, I think is a very interesting set of relationships. So I would suggest we go on maybe to questions.
Yeah, of course. Unless you've got anything else to add, Sven, on the key takeaways.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Let's move to questions if that makes sense.
Okay. Yes, everyone, don't forget to get your questions in via the chat pane. I'd like to dig into work redesign a bit more, Sven, if possible. It's maybe a rather large question, but it seems like a fundamental shift that hasn't really been discussed a great deal yet. And wondering if you can shed any light on how leading organizations are approaching work redesign to leverage AI.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously there's different stages or maturity aspects of AI within it. So there's some very basic generative AI use cases around generating, summarizing text. That is not particularly transformative all by itself. It does obviously have its effects on certain output numbers. It does have impact on productivity figures and these kind of things. It's certainly something not to be disregarded for sure, but what this point particularly refers to is more the introduction of agents, autonomous or more semi-autonomous agents that pick up some work and do perform some tasks a bit more autonomously under some guardrails, if that makes sense, and some policies that can be put around them. And this is an emerging field where a lot of organizations are currently thinking, a lot of investment is going into that space. So it's really at this HR's role within this is really looking at this. What does it mean from like what tasks can be replaced by HR? What effect does that have on the skills? What are the future skills that I need? How many do I need of this? And this is basically a true HR transformation project, basically, which similarly, we had that for other digital transformation pre-COVID or actually during COVID a lot of the times, where you basically needed to make those adjustments. What we're seeing now is obviously that this is much more driven by an analytical view of how the job architecture is going to change in the future, what skills are becoming more important, which ones are less important, and how do you build up these skills that you need in the future internally, or can you purchase them externally? But then also, what tasks can maybe a more agentic approach take over from a human being? So this is something where a lot of companies are currently thinking about this, and there are some specialist solutions who do this really well. They are possibly not necessarily all featured here on the Cloud HR 9 grid, but potentially more also on the Talent and People Success 9 grid, which is in an area where that is actually more the main driver. And by the way, this is going to come out not into the far future as well. So watch the space basically for David Perring's analysis around that. And I think it's definitely a space where very forward-thinking organizations, particularly on the large enterprise space, are currently looking into how they can explore these questions further strategically to give HR that table at the seat of the executives to be part of that conversation.
Yes, Talent and People Success coming out later this month. David, anything to add to what Sven's already said about that?
No, just to emphasis really that I think work and workforce redesign and that more kind of transformational view underpinned by better workforce intelligence is pretty much a clear direction of travel. But it's also not something that necessarily what we might call core HRS type systems are very well suited to do. So I think it's a kind of shift, and I think it will be a challenge actually again in the mid-market organization, in the mid-tier kind of players for them to step up. I think that the kind of enterprise HCM leaders the sort of large enterprise leaders, are fairly aware of a lot of that stuff. But I mean, it's obviously the next tier down, it's less prevalent. But as Sven said, at the moment it's more niche capability than it is mainstream, right? So I think it's there's still a lot of way to go before it becomes a material kind of capability within most of the platforms.
Thanks, David. On to a bit more about agentic AI, actually. It feels like a lot of platforms are at the start of this journey, and it's a term which is in the pantheon of talking about AI seems a lot more like something more recent that people have started talking about. So, Sven, have you got any predictions around, or are you seeing any use cases for agentic AI beyond just basic automation that a lot of people are already using?
So a lot of corporates are actually using, if that is the question, no, it's probably still below 10% of where people have things in production, is what one of our recent surveys in talent acquisition has shown. Talent acquisition being the field probably furthest ahead of all the domains within HR with it. So it's really still very much an early adopter play, but certainly one that keeps people quite occupied and is quite important from a strategic direction perspective. So, for example, we see such agents being employed in earlier parts of the recruitment funnel for some pre-screening questions, also for interview scheduling. In the more core HR people operations domain, it's also around processing timesheets, agents that might maybe recommend some redeployment options or suggest a swap in like shifts or schedules in line with obviously the labor rules. So I think that is where we are seeing a lot of vendors starting to introduce them. And the corporates are heavily relying on obviously the vendors bringing them into the solutions into the market. Some corporates actually have also built some of their own agents for rather narrow use cases with their IT teams. We are also seeing next year, 2026, that the EU AI Act will become more of a thing. So potentially the requirements on documentation and governance that these bring is certainly, making it harder for these standalone kind of initiatives, which are a bit more corporate only, to be quite a long time strategy. I would have my doubts. So I would imagine that this is shifting back to the vendors, and we have seen a lot of like from HR Technologies Conference in the US, there were a lot of announcements around such use cases from quite a few vendors. So I think it's definitely something where we will be hearing more of it, but in terms of actual adoption, it's still very much in pilot phase. Nothing that is really fully rolled out at full wide scale across the majority of the crops. That definitely is not the case.
David, anything to add to that?
No, other than watch this space, because we'll talk at the end about our AI market assessment stuff for Cloud HR. So we'll come back to this later, I'm sure.
Yeah, definitely. Just a reminder, do get your questions, put them in the chat. We have plenty of time left to ask all your questions about this year's 9-Grid for Cloud HR. A question from slightly earlier from Florence about Workday's, some of the issues around Workday with regards to data protection. I don't know if you've got any comment on that, Sven, at all.
So the question, just to kind of be more specific, was around the consideration around the hack. Obviously, I think it was in August, late August, Workday announced that it had some hacker issues with customer data. And the question from Florence is, does it influence our evaluation, etc.? I mean, just to provide a primary answer, obviously we try and track these things as much as possible. My understanding, and I've not been involved in any specific briefings related to it, but is that this was related to a customer support system, a third-party application, and that I don't think there's necessarily a lot of disclosure around it. It's certainly, I don't believe it was employee-specific data that was kind of being shared. I mean, I think a general comment is we try and track these and obviously understand how serious they're not, and do they destabilize the company. Obviously, there's a lot of this kind of activity going on all the time. You know, and we're in the UK, we've had lots of things recently around different major companies being hacked, including one most famously Jaguar Land Rover being shut down for best part of a month or more, and not producing any cars and everything else because of it. So in the case of the Workday assessment, I think we continue to track it. It hasn't materially impacted their business performance and growth as far as we're aware. But obviously it's one of those things, if it continues to be an issue, then obviously we would, you know, that would potentially be an impact going forward. Also, it was quite late on in the process as well. So again, I'm not really sure or in a position to think about how much that actually really influenced the overall recommendation. I think when you're looking at the momentum of a vendor overall, particularly an organization the size of Workday or an SAP or an Oracle, etc., you know, there are so many different factors we're considering as part of that process. And in particular, obviously, from a customer perspective, in understanding, you know, how this stuff impacts customer sentiment towards them, and the investment decisions that customers make going forward with those vendors. At the moment, we haven't seen that impact that from a Workday perspective. Sven, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, there have been other similar incidents in the past as well with some other providers. And obviously, we do track them. Usually there's, well, some vendors are very open with it, do a bit of a briefing to analysts, and obviously explain a little bit the background story. So I think that is helpful. What David said, I think, is also important, that we look at it through the customer's eyes and lens, if that makes sense. So depending on, you know, the type of issue that has occurred, the number of customers affected, and so on. Obviously, some of the things might have a smaller impact or a slightly greater impact. So yes, we do track it. Usually, if it's a very, very significant incident that causes significant customer frustration, this is something that you will then see only after some time being materialized, and then also customers moving away from vendors and maybe picking something else. So, but this is not necessarily something that you could see after like for weeks or whatever, if that makes sense. So I think from that perspective, yes, it's important to track these kind of things for sure.
Thank you, Sven. Question from Octavian. To what extent do you see these cloud HR systems ready to leverage external job intelligence data from more specialized talent providers, e.g. TechWolf, Lightcast, etc., in talent decision making? Is this an interoperability question? Sven.
Yeah, I think it is an interoperability question to some degree. So first of all, obviously, being able to integrate data and insights from data intelligence providers is quite important nowadays for large enterprises. So most of the suites probably at the higher potential band have quite a few customers with live integrations where this is the case. Some vendors have made investments from an HCM vendor's perspective into that space and bring it a bit more natively into the product, so into the UI. I think those are obviously then the processes where you can really link it quite nicely into the operational processes. And this is what a lot of organizations are gunning for. Oftentimes they do still prefer a specialist provider. And again, those specialists, Octavian, would be tracked probably more on the talent and people success grid. Here, obviously, Cornerstone has made acquisitions in the space, so that's maybe an option to consider here from the cloud HR providers on the list. Obviously, some of the suite providers have made investments in the past in this area, and have also announced some partnerships with these solutions. Sometimes it's even white labeling a provider like the ones that you have mentioned, so that you might not necessarily see them as under their own brand, but as something which just provides data into basically the customer organization. So there's different kinds of models, and some work better than others in my view. But then obviously that depends on your current or go forward ecosystem, if that makes sense. David, anything?
I just thought I would add to that is I think, all of the kind of the top right HCM platforms have now got skills capabilities and skills management capabilities, but in reality, the best skills intelligence. So I think it's kind of interesting. We'll talk about job intelligence, but I think when we think about skills intelligence, particularly and talent related stuff, I still think the leading solutions for those, as Sven said, are on effectively we assess those in our talent and people success. So companies like Eightfold or Beamery, TechWolf, Lightcast as well. They are all assessed within the talent and people success 9 grid. So you should be able to see that in the next few weeks as to where we've rated them. This is a huge piece of the ecosystem story. If you're in an organization that's shifting away from just job hierarchy into obviously skills or being a kind of central language almost for describing talent and growth and development particularly. So Cornerstone, as Sven mentioned, acquired a company called Skyhive, and actually even previously had acquired a company called Clustery in France, which was doing skills intelligence activities. But probably most of the players on here, or nearly all of them, are dependent on third parties for what I would call most of that skills intelligence, although they are capable of, they have their own capabilities around that and also have skills management system within, for example, Workday with Skills Cloud and so on, and similarly for Oracle and SAP. So there, in reality, I think when we look at corporate ecosystems, they tend to be betting more on those third parties or something like TechWolf also as a skills integration layer, like a middleware, really, to be able to pull across. And in the past, one of the challenges has been all parts of the HR ecosystem has wanted to own those topics and not share and play nice to some degree. So I think we've kind of evolved beyond that stage, but there still continues to be huge challenges for organizations, I think, in being able to connect all the dots here and make it work effectively. At the second level of the market, there's not been such an explicit drivers around doing those. I think the topics are still relevant, but the customer buyer hasn't got necessarily the sophistication or scale or the complexity of ecosystem to necessarily be able to solve those. But inevitably, they're getting sucked into the same conversation, I think.
Thank you, David. 15 minutes to go, plenty of time to get more questions in. One from Natalie Hannah. Sven, have you seen trends in adoption of all-in-one suites versus specialist providers? I guess we're talking, well, what kind of trends do you think we're talking about here, Sven?
Yeah, obviously, the economic situation has put quite a lot of pressure on organizations' budgets overall. HR budgets have been affected equally as well. TA probably feeling it first, learning in some regards too. And so do the wider HR budgets. That usually causes companies, decision makers in the past, usually driven from IT team, but now also from HR team, to try to get more value from their core system. So trying to consolidate more into one system is definitely where a lot of corporates have made significant investments in the past 2 years and try to adopt that more. The vendors, particularly here, are also benefiting from this and are maybe withstanding an otherwise difficult market because they can upsell more into existing customers. like attaching adjacent modules, activating some underused features, tightening like workflows that go across the suite. So I think that's definitely one side of the story. At the same time, specialist providers do also continue to see some very strong success in those very, dedicated areas that they're trying to disrupt, if that makes sense. So the answer is a bit of both is currently in play. We've already discussed at length some job intelligence, some skills intelligence kind of aspects of that, and how that plays into talent. Similarly, this is potentially true also for certain parts within talent acquisition, but also in learning. And here on the Cloud HR 9 grid, it's certainly true for more organizations are looking to consolidate their payroll ecosystem to fewer vendors, bringing it to a multi-country, I shall not say global payroll system and technology stack, because that is obviously very difficult to achieve. But organizations are certainly moving away from like 50 payroll providers to consolidate it maybe to 3 or 4 across the globe, if that makes sense. So I think that is an interesting one here, particularly then also the question, how do you deal with the long tail? How do you deal with employer of record, where you maybe only have 1 or 2, or just wanting to open an office and you have only maybe 1 to 10 or 20 employees, right? Those kind of decisions definitely continue to disrupt the suite or augment the core suite, because it's just economically maybe not necessarily viable to go all in with a very expensive high TCO suite in all of those very, small countries, if that makes sense. HR service delivery is an interesting area which post-COVID has seen quite some attention, and also from an employee experience perspective. This also continues to be still in play. But with the advent of AI, more cases can maybe now be deflected by AI, so that they are not getting a ticket for, okay, explain my pay slip in the first place, or explain like how many holidays can I still book this year? I mean, those kind of questions is definitely what co-pilots and chatbots can nowadays answer. So I think from that perspective, the other driver for this question, Natalie, and I think it's getting long, is around AI. So the overhead to evaluate a vendor on AI with all the governance questions that you need to cover off, that's also a driver for many companies to say, let's focus on fewer providers and get more of the things all into one, if that makes sense. So I think that's a very big part. For me, this would be for 2025, 2026, be a key issue to consider.
Thanks, Sven. Follow-up comment from Octavian. Looking forward to seeing the Talent 9 grid integration and interoperability are indeed key if someone is looking to bring that skills intelligence into various people processes. Any further comments, David, on what we've...
No, I think the only thing I'd add to what Sven said was that, I mean, because of the economic climate, particularly in Europe, as obviously, and the UK has been quite challenging, we know that that's impacted corporate decisions to some degree, and that there's more pressure for consolidation into single HCM. That's definitely, that wave is continued to be quite strong. But at the same time, especially when you look at a lot of the niche, the sub processes under it, particularly obviously in the whole of the talent and people success layer, as we call it, as Sven described it in the hexagon diagram earlier, or around some of the other things like skills intelligence and analytics and stuff. I mean, it's still dominated really by the specialists. So the area we saw the biggest negative impact on suites was actually in talent management, if you like, with the sort of increasing marginalization or even death of the talent management suite as a sort of single integrated thing. So that's happened over the last probably 5 to 8 years as HCM became more dominant at an overall strategic level. But then, in terms of looking at other areas underneath it, as I said, it's still, you know, specialists still become they're often the disruptors, right? And they're more, can be more transformational. And ultimately, going back to the hexagon diagram Sven showed earlier, you know, the important thing is to think ecosystem, not system, right? There's no such thing as a single platform or a company that has a single platform that they use to run everything and don't use anything else. There is still a reliance on external ecosystem partners, you know, both within HR at macro level, but also within the sub processes. You know, recruiting is itself an ecosystem market, learning is itself an ecosystem market. So definitely, I would say, think about that. And obviously that's where the specialists particularly are the ones that are often leading the conversation.
Thanks, David. Just under 10 minutes to go. Sven, I'd like to talk about payroll. One of the comments in key takeaways, payroll becomes low touch. You mentioned it earlier on, but are you seeing any fundamental organizational shifts or from the way that payroll is changing to becoming a lot more simplified and technologically driven, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of vendors are working on an intelligent pay slip kind of paradigm. So that links a little bit to the HR service delivery question I was referring to earlier. So making the pay slip explainable so that you can basically, as the person getting paid, ask questions, and the AI will then explain deductions, policies being applied, regulation that has changed and what have you. So I think that is where a lot of the vendors, for one, are more actively looking globally or internationally or within their area of remit on bringing that to life. And obviously for corporates, it means that they need to have their policies around time, pay, attendance, and these kind of things readily accessible for AI to basically leverage and dive into responses. There's a bit of carefulness here, obviously, because giving wrong answers could put you at risk in terms of legal perspectives, if that makes sense. So I think that's one of the things we see. In terms of the low touch, this refers a bit more to the administrator side of things, where machine learning validates inputs from the various sources in time and attendance and highlights some exceptions, triaging them, surfacing warnings already like earlier in the month. And this is complemented, especially in the UK. We've seen over the past years more of a move to real-time payroll. So obviously the ability to run an ad hoc run and see what impact picking another shift has made or will make on your salary, on your pay, both from an employee and from an administrator perspective, makes this possible. So I think that's probably two things that play together, or three things that play together all at once, if that makes sense. But payroll, historically, maybe 5 years ago, I would have said it's not the most innovative area in HR. It's actually become a really innovative area in HR. So if you haven't looked at your payroll technology stack, do look at it maybe again, if obviously some of those new technologies that have come to forefront, and quite a few vendors, both UK but also internationally, have made some very strong releases around this. So definitely something to maybe reconsider a little bit if you can consolidate this space a bit more further, or even put a global overlay on top, which makes it from a compliance perspective more accessible and more easily to report on all the things that are going on across the globe in terms of payroll and last mile and these kind of things.
David, anything to add on the payroll question? I think you're muted.
No.
One last thing. Another one of the key takeaways mentions the term edge advantage. So I thought I'd sort of close out this section by working it in, because it's terminology that we're using in the AI project, which we'll come on to talk about directly after this. But one of the key takeaways says AI and cloud HR provides vendors edge advantage. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, because it links quite nicely into what we're going to talk about next, Sven.
Yeah, so the term originates from our AI feature segmentation model, if that makes sense. And in Cloud HR, most of the providers are still rather slow to release those generative AI features, probably a little bit slower than some other areas like TA or even learning. And there's, in terms of what we looked at then, is how much consensus there is on where to apply AI in Cloud HR. And the consensus in Cloud HR is maybe not as strong across the board. And a small number of providers have then created some edge advantage for themselves by having the features where there is actually greater consensus, but they are live with them. So for this time in between where the others are playing catch up, those vendors are ahead and are able to possibly even build out further in terms of that advantage, as they can maybe then move to those more agentic use cases that we also discussed. So I think the report speaks about 2025 not being the year to replace the core HR system, but certainly you should, as a corporate, you should think about stress testing your vendors' roadmaps. You want to obviously be confident that they will deliver within the next 12 to 18 months. And this is what our AI research, the AI market assessment, goes into very much detail and actually looks at it on a vendor by vendor level even, if that makes sense. Maybe it's a good moment to move to the next slide then. David?
Yes, makes sense. So this is about the AI
John,
project,
yeah.
and I will hand over straight away to David to give us a better explanation and kind of to dig into this a bit more, because it's been a project a long time in the making and is now fully rolling along.
Yeah, so this is something that there is actually a reasonable chance you might see something on very soon from a Cloud HR perspective. So one of the things that we did in the early summer is published for a number of our segments, learning systems, digital learning, and talent acquisition, what we call an AI market assessment, which is looking at basically all of the vendor roadmaps across the segment and trying to analyze and work out effectively in simple terms what's real and what isn't. So how much of, we know there's a huge amount of hype and noise around AI, and if you go to any trade show now, everybody's an AI first vendor seemingly and everything, but there's massive differences between the vendors in terms of their AI capability and where they stand. So one of the things we're trying to do is look at, first of all, in terms of AI innovation and features, we're trying to analysis, work out how that clusters, how much is live or not. There's a bit of a sneak here because these images that Sven's included in the slide are actually real in terms of where they come from. So, overall only about 8% of the AI innovation in the Cloud HR space is actually live with customers, and that means that 92% isn't at various degrees. So the paper that's going to talk about all this in a lot more detail will be available imminently, potentially in the next week. I'd certainly emphasize people to have a look at that and do it. There's also a comparison view around the vendors, although the vendors aren't named, you can at least kind of see what the distribution spread are. And we're also doing, as Sven said, a sort of feature analysis, looking at it to work out how much is actually mainstream. So mainstream means live with more than 50% of the vendors, and the answer is rather underwhelming when you get there. So look, watch this space for that report. The key thing, the reason to include it here is that we're about to go into publish some of the outputs from this, and then we're also going to phase 2 of the project going into next year. And there's an opportunity from a corporate perspective to actually get involved in the project at a much deeper level. We've run probably 20 plus roundtables around AI in the last 12 months, and we can fill every one because companies are desperately trying to understand what's real, where others are, etc. Are they behind or not? And the majority of companies are still in very early stages. Most of the AI they're using is actually not from their HR vendor. It's actually coming more from their, from Microsoft or their wider IT strategy and so on. And this absolutely dominates the vendor roadmap. So, I think understanding from a corporate point of view, what's really going on, what's coming down the pipe towards you, which things are most interesting to you. Phase 2 project in particular is going to focus around adoption and value. So who's actually turning this stuff on, and are they getting value from it? So yeah, if you're interested in getting some deeper insights around this, as I said, watch this space for the AI market assessment for cloud HR. You can look at our website to see the others that are already live. And if you're interested in getting involved from a corporate perspective, obviously talk to Jack. His email is attached on this to find out a bit more about the project as a whole and the opportunities for involvement, or to leverage some of the outputs that we already have from phase 1.
Thank you, David. Anything quick to add, Sven, before I just close out the last couple of slides?
No, just going to say it's a very exciting report. You will love it.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so just recapping on corporate membership, scan the QR code for inside access to more detailed research, benchmark reports, analyst time, and corporate roundtables, as David has already mentioned. From our research, only 50% of HR tech buyers feel they chose the right solution, and only 50% of those implement it well. So there's something to think about. It just remains for me to thank Sven and David for their time. The links on the screen, there's obviously the full report for Cloud HR. Unleash World is coming up as well, if you're going to be there in Paris next week. There's a QR code for HR Realities, which is open currently. And of course, the Knowledge Center, which is where all these things are gathered together, along with insights, posts, all the papers related to AI, and all the viewpoint papers that the analysts have written historically. So quite a lot to dig into. Thanks again, Sven and David. Thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar as well. We'll be back very soon with another one. We've got a packed autumn of core research activity to bring you. So we'll see you all very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.